We've got some major news and rumors to discuss surrounding the New York Giants as they are starting to look for their new head coach. Is Joe Schoen going to be the general manager of this team going forward? And we've got some juicy things to discuss about Mike Tomlin potentially being the next guy. You're watching Giants Now by Chat Sports. I am your host, Marshall Green. Not the studio yet, but still want to get you guys a video. That's why you subscribe. When the Giants make a move, when there's news to discuss, we stop, drop, and roll and get you the information that you need. So please hit that big red subscribe button and help us get to 100,000 subscribers. If you are subscribed, give me a real one down below. We'll touch on Mike Tomlin. We'll touch on some extra fallout information about Brian Daboll, but I want to go right to this. Ian O'Connor, longtime New York sports columnist, saying this: I do not believe Joe Schoen is certain to be the Giants GM next year. They needed someone to get things going on the search, especially with John Mara dealing with his illness. Ownership will make the final call on the coach in January, talking about the new head coach, and he says that is when I would expect Joe Schoen to be reviewed again. Ownership will make the final call on the coach in January, and that is when I would expect an evaluation of Joe Schoen to happen again. That is something that is very newsworthy because Paul Schwartz, someone that has his finger on the pulse of the building at 1925 Giants Drive, he wrote the article about a week and a half ago saying it is a split ticket and Dabes and Schoen aren't a package duo. Schwartz wrote this in the New York Post. Monday late morning, John Mara and Steve Tisch had a conversation on the phone, and together they agreed it was time for a change. They called in their general manager, Joe Schoen, and informed him of their decision. Mara and Tisch had a conversation on the phone, and together they agreed it was time for a change. They called in their general manager, Joe Schoen, to inform him of their decision. So it was John Mara and Steve Tisch who ultimately pulled the plug on Brian Daboll. That comes from Paul Schwartz of the New York Post. Now, Ian O'Connor is saying ownership will make the final call on the coach in January. So we may be in the clear, ladies and gentlemen. Joe Schoen might just be getting fired. We'll continue to keep you updated on that. If you want the Giants to fire Joe Schoen, make sure you have hit that thumbs up icon. Do it if you want Schoen to get out of the building, because nothing matters until he is no longer the GM, as he is the GM. And as long as he is the GM, the Giants are telling their fans they are A-okay with losing, because that is what Joe Schoen does best. Lose football games. He's 20, 40, and 1 as the Giants general manager. Okay, so Ian O'Connor saying that Joe Schoen could be out, and it was Paul Schwartz writing that Steve Tisch and John Mara were the ones that pulled the plug on Brian Daboll. So there's that. Part 2 of today's show. Why is everybody talking about Mike Tomlin as a potential New York Giants head coach? There's been some chatter that the Pittsburgh Steelers over the last couple of years could be moving on from him. Ian O'Connor wrote this: why the Giants and Mike Tomlin would make for the perfect marriage. The evidence says the Giants already have their next Eli Manning. Now they need their next Coughlin, their next Parcells. Tomlin fits the profile. Ralph Vacchiano, longtime New York Giants beat reporter, now covers the NFC East and the NFL as a whole for Fox Sports. He mentioned Mike Tomlin as a potential candidate, saying, the idea of him and the Steelers parting ways has loomed for several years now, and if it ever happens, there will be a long line of teams waiting at his door. Don't overlook the strong internal connections between the Giants and Steelers organizations, though. It certainly would make it easy to work out a trade or soft landing for him. And no, the Giants wouldn't care that he hasn't won a playoff game since 2016. Something that I think is noteworthy, as also Rich Eisen drew a connection between the Giants and the Steelers and mentioned Mike Tomlin as a name to keep an eye on. The connection between the two. Shout out to my guy Monty on Twitter. Go give him a follow at Monte Cristo. The S is a 5. Go check him out. He says Chris Mara, and in fact, Chris Mara is married to a Rooney. So there's connections from the Giants to the Steelers. If Mike Tomlin becomes available, he is probably my number one choice. I know he hasn't won a playoff game. I know, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't lose a lot of games. He's never had a losing Steelers season as their head coach, and I think that he could get this organization back on track. But it wasn't just those guys that mentioned him as well. Mike Greenberg mentioned Mike Tomlin. We talked about Rich Eisen, Ralph Vacchiano, and Ian O'Connor all drawing the connection between Tomlin and the New York Giants. Another name I think everyone should be keeping their eyes on is Mike LaFleur. The reaction from all of the Packers insiders and beat reporters following their loss last night to the Eagles and before the loss last night is Mike LaFleur is on the hot seat, and he could be coaching for his job the remainder of the season. If he becomes available, he is near the tippy top of my list to be the next head coach for the New York Giants. So Joe Schoen may not be keeping his job. It was Steve Tisch and John Mara that fired Brian Daboll, and Mike Tomlin is a name to keep an eye on. I want to go through just a couple of things. Shout out to Big Blue Film Room on Twitter. They do a good job of aggregating stuff. I want everyone to get their proper credit. They tweeted out, several Giants players told ESPN after Sunday's loss that someone had to be held accountable, and they understood it was likely the coach, per Jordan Renan. Renan adds, the Giants locker room as a whole won't be too disappointed with Daboll's departure. Also, Connor Hughes says an anonymous offensive coach on another team told him the Giants coaching job is a desirable spot. Quote, Dart, neighbors with our scheme, F yeah, I would want that. Also saying, per Jordan Renan, another team considered hiring Brian Daboll years before the Giants, but didn't because he was, quote, too emotional. Renan added, ultimately, that was a big part of Brian Daboll's undoing. It always seemed to be someone else's fault. Jordan Renan also saying, and shout out to Breaking Big Blue, shout out to Bobby Skinner and the Giants Nation show as well. Renan said, we need a coach Renan was quoting a player who said, we need a coach who comes in here and doesn't care about what people on the outside think. Renan added that Brian Daboll was worried about what everyone else was thinking about his program. Renan, also on the Giants Nation show, shout out to Breaking Big Blue, mentioned Jesse Minter is someone everyone should be looking at very closely. We talked about Minter on our Brian Daboll replacements list that went out yesterday. I'm sure you're all subscribed and you saw all that video, all 20 names that I mentioned. So there is that. I'm going to scroll through my timeline to see if I see anything else at this point. I think it was Ian Rappaport as well as Jordan Renan mentioned some names. Lou Anarumo, current DC for the Colts, former DC of the Cincinnati Bengals, could be a name to monitor. He interviewed for the Giants job back in the Brian Daboll hiring cycle. Local guy, has some connections to the Giants, and he even worked for the New York Giants at one point. I've also seen Antonio Pierce be floated out there. To be honest with you, I have no interest in Antonio Pierce being the next head coach of the New York Giants. It was a train wreck when he was there in Las Vegas. Steve Spagnuolo, the former Giants defense coordinator, current defense coordinator for the Chiefs, multi-time Super Bowl champion. He is a name to monitor as well. We're going to hear a lot of names over the next weeks, maybe months, and so on and so forth. But this is going to be the spot that you need to hear about that. So subscribe, turn those notifications on, hit that like button. And my question to you before we bounce on out of here is, who do you want the Giants to hire as their next head coach? Sound off in the comments.